Good afternoon, everyone. Here I am with George from Ireland. I'm outside the High Commission of Sri Lanka in London, United Kingdom. So it's effectively the embassy, but within the Commonwealth of Nations, they don't call it an embassy. If it's Commonwealth to Commonwealth, it's a High Commission. And rather than ambassador, the person in charge is called a High Commissioner. United Kingdom, of course, being the former colonial metropole for Sri Lanka. And so it was Ceylon back in the colonial days, only changed its name in the 1970s, if memory serves. And so here we are, this white stuccoed splendid building in one of London's most exclusive districts, with just north of Hyde Park, and this is called Hyde Park Gardens indeed, this place. So I don't know if the High Commissioner actually lives in here. The residence is not necessarily the same as the High Commission. I have a feeling it's not. Surprised there are no protesters outside. So what's been going on in Sri Lanka for the last few months? Well, President Rajapaksa has really run the economy into the ground. So the Rajapaksa brothers have dominated Sri Lankan politics for 18 years. So Mahinda Rajapaksa served either as president or prime minister for most of that time. Then his brother Godbaya, if I pronounce that correctly, is president right now. And numerous other members of the family have held other posts, such as defense secretary, ambassadors to important countries, and so on. But it was going quite well for a long time. Sri Lanka was the richest country in South Asia. Its economy outstripped India by almost every metric, had a higher per capita income and so forth, steady economic growth, low inflation, on back of various sectors, partly tourism. They had a lot of Gastarbeiter in other countries, Middle Eastern countries. They had a significant expatriate community in the United Kingdom, indeed, proportionally much larger than India's actually, considering that Sri Lanka's a population of only 22 million people. One of the reasons for the success is Sri Lanka was so good at English. Obviously, Sinhalese is their major language there. 70% of them are native speakers of Sinhalese. But, you know, that only means that 15 million native speakers of Sinhalese in the world. So you either get good at English, you can never leave the country. There are very few books or films in Sinhalese. But it all went wrong. They were borrowing too heavily, particularly from China. The Chinese tend to drive a very hard bargain. I can hear the horses behind because they're heading off towards Hyde Park. The stable's very close to here. And there was sort of balance of payments crisis. They were really shortage of foreign currencies. They couldn't purchase oil and gas. So there was a severe shortage of fuel, couldn't make their cars go, couldn't generate electricity. Their electricity's been rationed. And of course, that put pay to tourism who would want to go there. You get to the airport. Well, then how can you get from the airport to your hotel? You get to the hotel. They've got no air conditioning, no electricity for anything. Food and fridges was rotting. They couldn't afford to buy new medicines for hospitals. People were dying avoidably of conditions which are easily curable if you have the right drug, but they couldn't get them. They couldn't maintain their medical equipment. So it was really disastrous. Taxi drivers, they couldn't make any money. Buses were scarcely going. How do you get to work or school, whatever? Officers didn't have electricity. So obviously Sri Lanka is a highly developed country now, and almost everybody's got electricity, and that's just not working. So it was a disaster. I mean, get out the bicycle, but sometimes you used to work for somewhere that's so far away that cycling there just wasn't practical. Horse-drawn carts, well, those went out half a century ago. So I wonder if riding stables are making a mint by renting out horses or having people go around in horse-drawn carts. I mean, it might seem to be a joke, but it's not so funny if you're actually living in the situation. So anyway, it was a catastrophe. So the Rajapaksa brothers have been popular because they defeated the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE. Remember, the Tamils are the indigenous ethnic minority, at least 20% of the population, mostly concentrated in northeast Sri Lanka, with their own Tamil language, the same ethno-linguistic group that are the preponderance of the population of Tamil Nadu, that state in South India. So the Tamils have said they didn't have a fair crack at the whip within Sri Lanka, and they'd begun that insurrection in the 1980s. I'm not saying that all Tamils were on that side, eventually defeated by the Sri Lankan army, but some of the Tamils in India were deeply sympathetic to their Tamil brothers and sisters, as it were, in Sri Lanka. And that's why India had intervened with the Indian peacekeeping force in the late 1980s to disarm the LTTE and to keep the peace between Sinhalese and Tamils. But it all came to grief, ended in the assassination of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991. What else has changed? Although there is peace in Sri Lanka, there's great unrest, and that's why there were enormous demonstrations. The country was really palsied, and not just by the lack of fuel. The police failed to defend the Prime Minister's residence, which was torched. That's Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's been Prime Minister on and off for 28 years. He's a barrister, like so many of those who've prospered in Sri Lankan politics. And until recently, surprisingly, a majority of Sri Lankan leaders were Christians, despite Christians only about 7% of the population. But to some extent, they were the educational and economic elite. Anyway, many of the people who are prominent in Sri Lankan politics are barristers, Rajapaksa and Vikramasinghe being no exception there. And that wasn't true in India since sort of the independence era, since Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and so forth. Anyway, so the presidential palace has been stormed in, I'm trying to get the name of it right, Jayawardena Kotte, that new administrative capital, which is effectively a suburb of Colombo, and they found that the air conditioning was abuzz, despite it being largely an uninhabited building, how wasteful that is, and people were taking an unscheduled dip in the presidential swimming pool. So the president being spirited away to an undisclosed location for his own safety. The crowd might have torn him apart. Now, it may seem ludic to begin with, but of course it's not quite so fun because there's going to be chaos. If the president's residence isn't safe, nobody's as safe. There could be a complete breakdown in law and order. The police could be really demoralised. On the other hand, what were the police to do? If they really couldn't hold back the crowd, if tear gas wasn't working and the crowd are throwing things, do they open fire? Firing in the air? Do they fire into the crowd? That could be dozens of people killed. That could be hundreds of people killed. Is that a better outcome than the president's residence being stormed, which admittedly I don't think killed anybody? So the police felt that there wasn't sufficient justification to fire live rounds into the crowd. It would have been seen as a massacre. But anyway, in the long run, what's going to happen? Is it going to be worse? Is there going to be bloody anarchy now? The president says he'll resign, so does the prime minister. Okay, but you get rid of those two men, that doesn't automatically solve the problem. The problem is really lack of fuel. Now, I know there's been economic mismanagement, but that doesn't guarantee that a new government can sort it out. So they're hoping for some emergency bailout of $3 billion from the International Monetary Fund. Would Russia help them out? But Russia will say, well, if you do something for us, we do something for us, we do something for you, we'll give you that cheap oil and gas like we're giving to India. But we want diplomatic support. You've got to vote our way. On the whole Ukraine issue, now Sri Lanka does that, they'll really alienate the United States and European Union countries, and that'll be a big problem for them. So they're caught on the horns of a quandary. How would they find their way out of this dilemma? But they need fuel flowing into the country to get the country moving, literally, as in cars, buses, trains, all the rest of it, to get enough electricity generated to get the economy moving and to have confidence in the system. But the lack of a stable government is not going to inspire confidence, and investors will not like the uncertainty. So Sri Lanka is in a terrible fix. I don't know how they're going to get out of it. They do have a significant overseas community, and I wonder if these Sri Lankans in other countries are going to be funding them. You see that? Horse-borne transport, that could be the solution. And here we are on this Muse Street with cobblestones there, and the horses have obviously eaten not so long ago, as you can see the evidence behind me. Right, so that's it from Sri Lanka, a highly delightful country that I went to many moons ago. I very much recommend it. It's obviously cooled by the oceanic breezes, seems demi-paradisical, and I would like to revisit it one day, as mostly a Buddhist country, of course. The Sinhalese people are mostly Buddhists, whereas the Tamils are mostly Hindus, and about 10% Muslim, about 7% Christian. That's enough from me, so thank you so much for watching my channel. Goodbye.